a story is important. We all know that. They can lift you up, they can make you feel better, they can make you feel smarter, they can teach you something, they can encourage you to do things, right? But what about the sequel? Well, sequels are often considered not as good as the original. They're normally frowned upon, and, I get it. I really do. A lot of the time, they can just be people trying to squeeze a buck out of something that was popular. But they still do hold a value. They bring us back to the world we love. They, normally give us an insight into the characters and how their lives have progressed, or we get to see how things came to be. But they are still sequels, so the quality is always, hit or miss. But today we're going to look at two sequels that honestly do a little bit of both. I'm talking about Code Geass, Rozé of the Recapture, and Mobile Suit Gundam GQuuuuuX. So, I will be comparing the two newest sequels to these incredibly popular mecha franchises. And today, I will see which of them has the better story, the better characters, the better production value, what is the better sequel to the original IP, and what is overall the better show. So, welcome to your journey. I am Roxy World, and let's get started with the story. Now, for the story, what is it? Well, Rozé of the Recapture is a very similar retread of the original Code Geass plot. It involves a semi-Britannian intellectual with the power of Geass fighting against the oppressive Britannian regime in order to save one of their family members, in this case a sister. And simply put, it's pretty good, but it does, relatively speaking, retread a lot of similar ground to the original, with even some recycled villains and some major recycled plot points. However, it does add some necessary changes, but those are mostly tied to I'm just gonna say it, the best character in the show, Ash. But we'll be talking about him in a bit. Anyway, getting on to GQuuuuuX, what is that story about? Well, it's the what if scenario of what if Char Aznable took the original Gundam, and then how would that change the Universal Century as a whole. Now, when we follow it, it takes place a little bit after the 1 Year War, kind of similar to a Zeta Gundam, except think of it as a Zeta Gundam to an alternate dimension. And which one do I think is better? After giving those brief summaries, I'm going to be frank, it's GQuuuuuX. So, why do I think that? Well, it's pretty easy, actually. Rozé of the Recapture is a very similar product to Code Geass, except it's a sequel. So, why would you watch the same thing again? Right? Especially when that same thing only adds a small amount of differences from the original. Now, does it have original parts to it? Yes. Does that spice up the story in a meaningful way? Yes. Is it enough to completely distinguish itself from the original and allow it to stand on its own 2 feet? Unfortunately, no. And while obviously a sequel has to almost always has to be connected to the original, I think this takes it a step too far. On top of that, GQuuuuuX asks one of the best and most prominent Gundam what-ifs ever asked, and that is, what if Char was able to steal the Gundam? How would things change? And while it doesn't necessarily do the greatest part in that, it still does provide a decent enough outlook on this very popular what if, to the point where we, the audience, get put through the ringer and get thrown into this kind of dark, kind of fun, kind of crazy story. On top of that, It does have the multiverse aspect, which unfortunately will be dating GQuuuuuuX. But hey, every series has got to show its age. I just didn't think it would show it that fast. Now, with me summarizing both of the stories, I would argue that GQuuuuuuX is superior. So that is 1 point in Gundam's corner. Now, let's move on to characters. And where do we start? Well, there are two main characters on both sides, I would argue, that being Ash and Sakura, and then Nyan and Machu. Now, I actually prefer Machu over Sakura, but I do think Ash is better than Nyan. So they're kind of even. However, I will say that at least for a lot of individuals, I can see why they would prefer Sakura, just because her, I guess, goal is a lot easier and as trying to rescue your sister compared to Machu and her kind of change over time where she goes from being super obsessed with Fuji and then slowly maturing into an adult as she slowly realizes, and then at the end she doesn't really need him, but she has the satisfaction of knowing that they're going to meet again and stuff of the sort, right? They obviously cooked and made both plot points and characters very good. However, Sakura does allow just just individuals like myself and what I believe the audience would most likely be able to relate to much easier. Now, comparing Ash to Nyan is even worse. Ash is a fully realized character who is integral to the plot. He provides a nice contrast and comparison to Sakura. He motivates her, he provides a great dynamic for her, and he is honestly the best part of the entire show. Then you compare that to Nyan. I believe Nyan was underutilized. Not only did the promotional material, trailer, and everything of the sort make it seem like she was going to be the secondary main character, she doesn't affect the plot as much as you really wish someone of seeming importance as her did. On top of that, I wouldn't really say she necessarily provides anything other than just initial shock value with things of her piloting the Gundam and, angering Machu or anything of the sort. She doesn't necessarily create as functional as a dynamic for the story as Ash and Sakura. So, honestly, I would argue that while I actually like Machu more, I think that Sakura and Ash are better main characters for their individual series compared to Nyan and Machu. However, this is where we get into the actual upset, because just as what I've been describing, you would expect, well, then Rose wins. Except they don't. This point is going to GQuuuuuuX again. Why, though? I gotta explain why, right? And that's simply due to the fact that, well, they got some heavy hitters on the side characters. Not only do the the Gundam Underground Fighters, they provide an interesting enough outlook. The, obviously, Captain, he is very engaging. And then, of course, the magnum opus character that is Char Aznable. Char Aznable actually shows up in this sequel, unlike a certain Lelouch v. Britannia. Now, obviously, I've told you before, both Lelouch and Char are some of my favorite characters in the mecha genre, period. I know it's a basic opinion, I don't care. It's my opinion, right? So, just having Char, while having Char as a main contributor of the plot is just naturally very nice and very enticing to individuals, it's not enough to completely upset it. But including the fact that Char at least provides a main sort of story-focused beat in the plot, whereas Lelouch really doesn't appear. It just makes it just boasts the side cast even further. On top of that, I would argue the side cast in Rose of the Recapture is actually the poorest in Code Geass. This is just due to the fact that a lot of them feel like a direct retreading of the original Lelouch of the Rebellion. And simply put, it's just not that good. Like, it's the same character. We have Cullen again. We have, like, Ogi again. We have all these characters again. And the question is, why would I spend my time listening and watching the same character? If I'm watching a Code Geass series and they're like, hey, none of the old characters are coming back except in cameos, I'm like, okay, fine, I understand that. And then they give us brand new characters that they're like, these are brand new, and then I look at them and I'm like, so did Colin like dye her hair purple? Like, I know this isn't as professional sounding, but simply put, when you are trying to entice me with a new series or a new story in the world that I love, but you promise me it's going to be a new story with new characters, I expect that. I do not expect the same characters again, except lower quality, which, to be fair, is not their fault. They do try to give these characters screen time, but simply put, 12 episodes is not enough to try to recapture the lightning in a bottle that was the original cast of Code Geass. Now, I know I'm sounding very negative. I'm not trying to, but, well, that's just the way the cookie crumbles. Anyway, I'm just gonna say this very clearly. I think that overall, while the main characters do provide a very solid base for the rest of the show, the sidecast doesn't fully follow through. Whereas GQuuuuuuX is elevated by its sidecast and also its antagonists. I'm gonna be honest, antagonist to antagonist. I'm not gonna spoil too much, but I just want to say that GQuuuuuuX's antagonists are much better. Now, let's move on to production value. And this one is quite hard. They do obviously have some similarities. So, for production, they were originally movies that were released in theaters, except I don't get to see those movies because, you know, I don't live in Japan. Thanks, guys. But, so, then they got transferred or transformed into TV shows that lasted 12 episodes and yada yada. Now, obviously, they're movies, so they look quite good. I know, shocker. Also, Sunrise. I don't know if you guys know this, but Sunrise and Bandai, they have this cool thing called money. I know, crazy. I've never seen it either. But, like, they both look good. So, honestly, it's just a preference of what I think was able to bring the world to life better, I guess. And I do think that there were more instances of me being wowed in Rose of the Recapture. Obviously, both of them come alive in the fight scenes, and I will give this, though, to GQuuuuuuX. I think the lighting is better in GQuuuuuuX. I think with how much effort they put into the reflecting the light off of mobile suits, or when they're in a sewer system and there's sort of this green-blue luminescence, I think that when it comes to lighting of a scene, GQuuuuuuX is superior. However, overall character expressions, I would say Rose of the Recapture I like more. On top of that, I would say that the details and backgrounds, along with even the mechs, I would argue Rose of the Recapture wins in this category. So, although I should specify they're both really good. You're watching clips of them now on the video. Unless I'm too lazy to put them in, but I hope I'm not that bad. But yeah, you'll see. You see them. You should be looking at the screen right now and being like, oh yeah, that looks pretty good. But yeah, overall they both look good. I'm just going to give the slight edge to Rose. Now, let's move on to what I think is the better sequel. Now keep in mind, this doesn't mean better overall product. I just mean as a sequel that Rose of the Recapture is to the original Code Geass and Lelouch of the Resurrection, compared to GQuuuuuuX's as a semi-sequel slash what if to, well, the original and also kind of Zeta Gundam. Because, like, it is kind of almost like a what if that includes a lot of Zeta stuff. And I'm going to be honest, this one is kind of a toss-up, because while Rose of the Recapture is clearly its own story, it doesn't really affect any of the main characters of Code Geass. Like, spoiler alert, Lelouch doesn't die in Rose of the Recapture, okay? He doesn't die, C2 doesn't transform into Gigan or something of the sort. There's nothing that crazy for the characters from the previous iterations, right? However, it does show the progression of the world, it shows the world changing. So, from that aspect, it is a solid enough sequel. However, this could only really be judged how good of a sequel it is to the original and the Resurrection once another series comes out. I personally do believe that we are going to get more Code Geass content just due to the fact that it's incredibly popular. Like, it's insane. But, you know, what can you do? Now, moving on to GQuuuuuuX. GQuuuuuuX does the Gundam thing. So, a lot of people think that Gundam is this one big overarching story. And a lot of it is. There is a lot. Like, original Mobile Suit, Zeta Gundam, Double Zeta, Char's Counterattack, Halfway, F91, all this stuff, right? That is the main ending off with Victory, technically Crossbone Gundam, but I haven't read it yet. So, yeah, that is the main Universal Century. And then you got spin-offs like Wing, 00, Seed. You got all these, right? Even the Build Fighters. Now, that means you can watch these sequels, I guess is the best way, and without watching the original. And GQuuuuuuX is in kind of a similar boat, but not really. GQuuuuuuX heavily relies on you knowing about the original Gundam. So it is basically a sequel, just a sequel that is in a different dimension, you know? However, it is important to know that this isn't too much of a detriment, especially if you know Gundam, which you most likely should, but also it is a Japanese series, and while Gundam it's definitely big over here, don't get me wrong, it's very big over here. You're really gonna tell me that Gundam isn't big in Japan? Like, come on, guys. They built a statue of the thing, for Pete's sakes. It's very important, so everyone knows that. So it's not as much of a detriment as you think, or as I'm painting it. However, I would argue that since it's not part of the Universal Century, it doesn't truly act as a sequel. It does act as a fun what-if. However, it will never be anything more than that. If we get a GQuuuuuuX Season 2, that changes the story. I would love that. I would love this alternate timeline to get its own Zeta. Give us GQuuuuuuX Zeta. That'd be incredibly fun. I want to see what adventures Banagher gets up to, or what goes on in the Victory era of this universe. That sounds awesome. However, simply put, being an alternate universe, while it is definitely intrinsically linked to the original, it is not enough to basically have me put the full force behind it that I would a normal sequel. Which is why, even though Rose doesn't do everything by the book, and it isn't the greatest sequel ever made, it is still a good continuation and further look into the Code Geass world. So for the final point of being a sequel to a series, sequel slash spin-off, I'm giving it to Rose. However, now it's time to tally up the score, and they're actually tied 2 for 2. So now this comes to a little known fact called my personal opinion. And I'm going to be real, as an individual, I think that when I tally up all the points and how I feel about both of these, I gotta give it to GQuuuuuuX. Considering I think it has a better story, I think it has better characters, and it rivals the production of Rose. I think Rose is slightly better, but GQuuuuuuX is still on that level, so it's not as big of a gap as I would say between the two. And then that means the only point that they really take is it being a sequel. However, I will also mention that if Rose of the Recapture is the final installment in the Code Geass series, I will be disappointed as an individual. I'm just going to be real. Just due to the fact that I did not think it was amazing. I thought it was fine. I gave it a 6 out of 10. But overall, I obviously don't... I think it is a downgrade from the original, and I even think it's a downgrade from Lelouch of the Resurrection. Now, I think that it will continue to go forward, as I've stated prior, but I really do hope that it continues, just due to the fact that I think the thing that holds Rose the furthest back from being itself is the fact that it's trying so hard to be the original series. They want you to think of it as, well, Code Geass again, except, simply put, you can't capture lightning in a bottle twice. It's already hard enough to do it one time, you know? On top of that, you've already done... Like, this isn't someone trying to give their own spin on Code Geass, or a show that takes it in a different direction. For example, from what I hear, Guilty Crown is kind of similar to Code Geass, but takes it in a general different direction. Please watch a video on that. I am not the final say on anything Guilty Crown, but that's just from what I hear as an individual. However, with things like Rose of the Recap, it is Sunrise and the team of Code Geass making Code Geass again. So it does feel a little bit lazy, which is not something you ever want a production to feel like. And while I know that's very disingenuous to say anything about making a movie is lazy, I know for a fact animation is already terrible. You guys see what I put on my channel, and that takes me like weeks to make. And it's not even that, so I have utmost respect. But it does feel like the script itself has been recycled, and you never want that to feel. Now, overall, I would recommend both these shows. However, I do think GQuuuuuuX offers more value just as an overall show, whereas Rose of the Recapture is really valuable because it's the latest iteration of a Code Geass continuation. Once Code Geass Suzaku of the Suspenseful or whatever comes out, then we will obviously move on to that. But for now, unfortunately, Gundam did beat Code Geass, guys. I don't know what to tell you. Hey, Gundam fans, I hope you enjoy this victory. Anyway, I had a lot of fun talking about this because I do like both these shows. Despite the fact that, I didn't give them the best score, I'm actually going to throw up a graph of what I gave every single episode with a comparison to Grendizer U on screen so you guys can see. I didn't give the best marks for any of the episodes or even the series as a whole. I still do love them. I really do enjoy Mecha. I love that we're getting new products. And you know what? Consumerism isn't such a bad thing if you get all these fire shows. Anyway, I've had a lot of fun. I hope I get to hear you guys tell me why I'm wrong in the comments section. And this is Rox signing off. Have a good day, everyone.